Welcome everybody. It's really great to have you all here tonight to our first of 4 speaker series this season. I'm going to start off by asking that you all mute your cell phones. You may have noticed on the way in we have an entourage this evening. We're really lucky to have C-SPAN here filming tonight's presentation. Bergen 250, we're working our way to 2026 and we're really excited to be able to offer this programming to you. I want to thank the County Executive and the Board of Commissioners for providing funding for this program. Without them, we can't carry this mission forward. I want to thank Bob Carpenter before we get started for all the work he does behind the scenes for the Revolutionary War Roundtable here in Bergen County. He's really the driving force behind all this. So Bob, thank you. He gets great people like our presenter this evening, Keith Muchowski. He is a librarian and professor at the New York City College of Technology in Brooklyn for the last 15 years. He has volunteered with the National Park Service at sites such as Ellis Island, the Theodore Roosevelt Birthplace, Federal Hall, Grant's Tomb, and other locations. But tonight, we're really lucky to have him here to speak about Hackensack's very own Lieutenant Colonel Richard Varick. Keith, thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, Colin, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's such an honor to be here in Bergen County and speaking in New Jersey, which in many ways was the focal point and the crossroads of the American Revolutionary War. And I would like to thank Robert Carpenter again for inviting me, and thank Colin Knight for that warm introduction, and thank all the organizers who helped put this together. And today I'm here to talk about one of New Jersey's forgotten sons, and that would be Richard Varick, who, while spending a great deal of his life across the Hudson River in New York City, was born and died and is buried here in New Jersey. He's actually buried right down the road from here in the old Dutch church, and actually came to this era after a fateful trip in June of 2018 to the Museum of the American Revolution, because prior to this, there was really more, my intellectual interests were more towards the American Civil War. But I took a day trip with a friend of mine to Philadelphia from New York City in June of 2018, and this kind of spun me off in this direction. And also, one thing that fascinated me about this era, which I really, again, never thought too much about until 6 or 7 years ago, because I always kind of thought of the revolution period as kind of dead history or something, and you know, I didn't really think too much about it. I thought it was kind of settled history, and that trip to the Museum of the American Revolution opened my eyes to that, and so I've been off on this journey ever since. And also, as a historian, I kind of classify myself as what I like to call a global Americanist. And what I mean by that is I'm very much a student and a scholar of American history, but I see it through the lens of the United States in international affairs. And as I think a lot of you know, the United States achieved its independence with the help of the French and the Dutch and the Spanish. And so ever since then, I've been on this journey, and every day I feel like I'm learning something new, and so it's all very exciting. And I also have an interest in Dutch history. You know, how can you not have an interest in Dutch history when you live in Brooklyn? Because Dutch history is all around you if you know what to look for. And but I don't really have the necessary language skills, you know, to study Dutch history, and so I've always kind of thought of the Varicks as being my in for Dutch history, and so it's very exciting. And so here is the man of the hour, Richard Varick, who was born in Hackensack on March 25th, 1753, of Old Dutch stock. His parents were Johan Varick, John Varick, and Jane Dye. Varick is an interesting figure because he was sort of the Walter Mitty of the American Revolutionary War, and he tended to, he was one of those historical figures who always seemed to be, where major events were taking place. and he always seemed to be working with very important figures. And here are some of the people under whom Richard Varick served during the American Revolution. And the one on in the middle is Alexander McDougall, who was the colonel of the 1st New York Regiment, in which Richard Varick was a captain. And on the far left, we have Major General Philip Schuyler, who basically concurrently, at the time that Richard Varick was serving under McDougall in the 1st New York Regiment, he was also serving in the Northern Department, sometimes called the New York Department, under General Schuyler. So he was really wearing 2 hats at the same time in the early years of the Revolution. And eventually, he came to work under the command of this guy, Major General Benedict Arnold, and a few fans of whom we have here in the audience tonight. And the spoiler alert, yes, he was there in New York. Varick was during General Arnold's treason. And so he worked for these figures. And then he spent the last 2.5 years of the Revolution serving under this guy, Commander-in-Chief George Washington himself. So we have a portrait of Washington. I'll talk a little bit more about this letter, but here's a letter that Washington wrote to Richard Varick on New Year's Day of 1784. By this point, the war had been over. Evacuation Day had been November 25th. And so by January 1st of 1784, George Washington is a civilian once again, and he's back at his home in Mount Vernon, and he's writing letters, including this one, which is on Founders Online, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later. And after the war, he was only 30 years old, Richard Varick, when the war ended, which shows you how young some of these figures were. And but he was active in politics after that. He was a member of the New York City Common Council. He was the recorder of New York City, which is a position that doesn't exist anymore, but he was basically the number 2 person behind the mayor. And he, with another attorney named Samuel Jones, he helped to revise and digest all of the laws of New York State since the time of the writing of the state constitution. He was the Speaker of the New York State Assembly. He was the State Attorney General. And most famously, Richard Varick was the mayor of New York City. He was the mayor of New York City from 1789 until 1801. So he was the mayor of New York City for 12 years. And so basically throughout the age of federalism. So 1789, Washington is sworn in April of 1789, and Jefferson becomes president in 1801. So 1789 to 1801, what we call the age of federalism. And Varick was the mayor of New York City throughout the age of, throughout that period. Here we have a portrait of Varick, which was painted by John Trumbull in 1805. And here we have New York City Hall as it looked around the time. So here's New York City Hall, which would later become Federal Hall. And if you know New York City, if you know this area, this Federal Hall, there's a new Federal Hall, if you will, there, which was built in the 1840s, which is a whole other story. But this actually looking west down Wall Street, and here we have Trinity Church right here. So to give you a sense of where this is. So that's Trinity Church on Wall Street, right there. And he, so some things that happened in New York City during Mayor Varick's time in office were such things as the Jay Treaty, of which Richard Varick was a supporter of. The Citizen Genet affair during the French Revolution took place during Richard Varick's mayoralty. The Quasi-War with France took place during Richard Varick's mayoralty. There was a yellow fever pandemic that killed thousands of people, including Richard Varick's physician brother in the 1790s. There was the financial panic of 1792, And there was the Buttonwood Agreement of 1793 that laid the foundation for New York City as the capital that it is today of investing and finance. All of these things happened during the mayoralty of Richard Varick. During his tenure as mayor, the population doubled from about 30,000 to about 60,000. And he left office in 1801. Spoiler alert, he lived another 30 years. He died in 1831. And he was active, Richard Varick was, in many business ventures. One business venture in which Richard Varick was active was in the founding of what at the time was called Paulus Hook, but you and I know it today as Jersey City. So Jersey City was actually founded in 1804 by, here we see a surveyor's rendering of the plots that you can invest in Jersey City in 1804. And Varick was one of the investors, along with Jacob Ratcliffe and Anthony Dye. Richard Varick was active in philanthropy. I actually took these images at the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati Library, there on DuPont Circle, where I did a fellowship in July of 2022. And so he was very active in philanthropy. So we see here some certificates. He was active in missionary societies and education and the American Bible Society and many other things too. He was active in philanthropy in a number of areas, and so he was active in banking, and he also helped preserve the history and memory of the Revolutionary War through his activity in such organizations as the Society of the Cincinnati, which I just mentioned, which is a fraternal organization that was begun originally by officers in the Continental Army. And he died in July of 1831. One challenge in studying this era can actually be the paucity of resources, but there's actually more out there than one might originally suspect. What we're looking at here, actually on the left, this is actually a book cover, Dutch New York Between East and West, the world of Margaretha van Varick. In 2009 and 2010, Bard College in Manhattan, their Manhattan campus, actually had an exhibit of materials pertaining to Margaretha van Varick, who was born in Europe and spent some time in Dutch Malacca out in the Pacific and eventually settled in Brooklyn, New York. And she ran she was basically a trader, an international trader, and she bought and sold goods from throughout the Dutch Empire in the 17th century. And it's actually interesting because if you look, the world of Margaretha van Varick. So they are Dutch, obviously, but as the Varicks multiplied and spread forth and anglicized, they dropped the van and they become the Varicks. So they were the Van Varicks and then the Varicks. So I love this too, just because I love the color. Like sometimes when we think of the past, we think the past took place in black and white, but the past didn't really take place in black and white. We know better, and but just look at the beautiful color on these. And so she was actually a descendant, an ancestor, I should say, of Varick, and it actually gets even more complicated because another member of the Varick, in the Varick world, was this individual, James Varick. James Varick was an enslaved man who was he was enslaved within the Varick family. James Varick actually would later become a bishop in the AME Church. James Varick was actually one of the founders of the black church. So when we think of the history of the black church in America, actually it was a Varick, James Varick. There actually still there are still churches in the United States who honor James Varick. There are these two. There's one in Brooklyn and there's one in New Haven. So it's a really it's a very complicated and fascinating history. So one thing I think that it's important to realize when you're talking about Richard Varick is that he was really a Varick, but he was also a Dye. He was a member of the Dye family. And he was born here in Hackensack in 1753 and spent the first 18 years of his life here in Hackensack, which was a very bucolic Dutch enclave. It was a great place for a young man to grow up. And he grew up with private tutors, and he studied French and Latin and other languages. And in 1771, just after his 18th birthday, Richard moved to New York City to clerk for an attorney named John Moore and Scott. And it was a consequential decision to move across the water, and one indicative of a trend that would continue for the rest of Varick's life, in that he would become the trusted underling and confidant of a powerful, well-respected figure. John Moore and Scott was one of the leading attorneys in New York City, which at the time was a very insular world, with really just a few dozen lawyers, collaborating or competing in equal measure, depending on the clients and the workload. And John Moore and Scott was actually 1/3 of what we call the New York Triumvirate. And so we see John Moore and Scott here on the far left. And so the New York Triumvirate, these were the three leading attorneys in New York City in the 15 to 20 years just prior to the outbreak of the Revolution. And we have John Moore and Scott on the far left, and in the middle we have William Smith, Jr., who was an attorney, and he would go on to become a judge. He would actually go on to become a loyalist during the war, and he would he was a judge in Manhattan during the British occupation, and when the war ends, he moves to London briefly and eventually settles, William Smith does, in British Canada, where he served as a judge in British Canada. So William Smith in the middle became a loyalist, and then the final third of the triumvirate was William Livingston, who we see on the far right, who I think, as you can probably guess, was part of the Livingston family. And so John Moore and Scott was 1/3 of the Livingston, of the triumvirate. Clerking for an attorney like John Moore and Scott would have entailed long hours of drudge work, drafting wills and copying court briefs and doing whatever mundane tasks really needed to be done in an office as busy as John Moore and Scott's was. And this was in addition to studying British law, because of course New Jersey and New York were both British colonies, right? So if you were an attorney, you were going to study British law. You were going to study things like Blackstone's commentary, which we see here. Actually took that picture at the Grolier Club during their Lincoln exhibit a couple of years ago. So he would have studied things like Blackstone's law, which was published in England in the late 1760s and made available in the United States starting in 1771 and 1772. So actually, to Varick, something like Blackstone's had just been released when he was studying it in the early 1770s. Richard Varick actually, he passed the New York bar in October of 1774. Actually, he passed the bar the same week that the First Continental Congress was adjourning in Philadelphia. And of course, as we know, the war breaks out 6 months later. So this was the milieu in which Richard Varick spent his clerking. Richard Varick's revolution, his military career began on June 28, 1775, when the Second Continental Congress commissioned him a captain. Varick was assigned command of the 6th Company of the 1st New York Regiment. Leadership of the 1st New York's 2nd Company was given to Marinus Willett, a great-grandson of Margaretha van Varick, and thus a cousin once or twice removed of Richard Varick. On June 30th, the New York Provincial Congress appointed Alexander McDougall colonel of the New York 1st. McDougall had been a privateer during the French and Indian War and active in the Sons of Liberty, along with John Moore and Scott, going back nearly a decade. With the help of Scott, on July 1st, Varick was also appointed secretary, as I mentioned, to Philip Schuyler in the New York department. Varick would also be the New York department's unofficial quartermaster, requisitioning any and all provisions that might be needed. I actually took this picture too at the American Revolution Institute library at the Society of Cincinnati there in DuPont Circle. And there's just something about, holding something like this in your hand, right? And we love to read the books and look at things online and all of that. But so here we have this is his handwriting in the account books in General Schuyler's Northern Department. And remember, he was doing this while he was also doing this for Schuyler, he was also working under the command of McDougall in the 1st New York Regiment. Major General Schuyler and Captain Varick boarded a transport ship on the North River and landed in the general's hometown of Albany on July 9th, 1775. Because an invasion of Canada was a priority and the recently captured Fort Ticonderoga a natural jumping-off point, in making that happen, they quickly went there. Soon joining them would be Brigadier General Richard Montgomery. That summer, Schuyler prepared a two-pronged attack on Canada, with Montgomery to command one and Benedict Arnold the other. Schuyler soon became bedridden with rheumatoid arthritis and gout and put Montgomery in charge and returned to Albany. And here we have a picture of that. The Canadian offensive began well, with the rebels taking Montreal pretty easily. Here we see an image of the rebels taking Montreal. This picture was, this is a rendering from the mid-19th century. And here we have a drawing of Richard Montgomery, and who was actually killed trying to take Quebec on December 31st of 1775. And Rick Atkinson, when he writes about that in Volume 1 of his soon-to-be trilogy, mentions Sir Guy Carleton. He's recounting of that and talking about, writes about how the rebels were repulsed by slaughter there at the gates of Quebec. And so Montgomery is killed in Quebec. And on New Year's Day, 1776, military victory over the powerful British looked uncertain, and independence still not necessarily even the goal for many colonists. Tom Paine published Common Sense on January 10th. The pamphlet quickly became a bestseller and swayed a significant portion of public sentiment to the rebel cause. Captain Varick himself remained in upstate New York, working his dual roles in the 1st New York Regiment and the New York Department. There were many tasks to keep the young officer, still in his early 20s, busy in Albany, Fort Ticonderoga, and vicinity. On June 9th, 1776, the New York Provincial Congress, of which John Moore and Scott was a member, appointed Scott a brigadier general in the New York militia, just in time, as it turned out, for the arrival of the Howe brothers. General Howe's British troops were spotted off Staten Island on June 29th. Now, all New Yorkers grasped the danger of the Howe brothers' arrival in New York City, which is why John Moore and Scott had sent his daughter across the Hudson River to the New Jersey home of William Livingston, who in 1772 had left New York City to settle here in New Jersey and become a gentleman farmer. And so here we have anybody ever been to Liberty Hall? Yeah, it's a great place, isn't it? And actually took this photograph we see, took this a couple of summers ago. What happened was at Liberty Hall probably about 10 years ago now, they were doing some renovations and they punched through a wall and they found this hidden wine cellar. And included in the wine cellar are bottles of Madeira, which date back, which are like over 200 years old at this point. So I tried to get them to open those bottles of Madeira. I said, let's just open one and no one will notice the difference. But I couldn't get them to do that, but go figure. And so John Moran Scott actually became a general. He was actually with George Washington during the Council of War just before the evacuation of Brooklyn. John Moran Scott was actually part of the evacuation. And Varick actually resigned from the 1st New York Regiment on September 14th, 1776, which, if you're doing the math, is about 2 weeks after the Battle of Long Island. But his duties expanded, however, when the Continental Congress appointed him Deputy Muster Master General of the Northern Army 11 days later. This job primarily entailed keeping track of units and individuals within the New York Department and preparing muster rolls to ensure troop readiness and payment of wages. The Continental Congress further codified that position with the creation of the Muster Department on April 4th. Congress confirmed Varick in the Deputy Muster Master General title on April 10th and promoted him to Lieutenant Colonel. Now, things remained tenuous as the British were determined to squeeze the Northern Army and attack from Canada. But as I think you might know, that did not come to pass. And so in October of 1777, the seemingly impossible happens when Lieutenant General John Burgoyne surrenders to Horatio Gates. And Richard Varick, he is not in this painting, but he actually did witness the surrender, Burgoyne's surrender to Gates. And ironically, when Trumbull painted this, he put General Schuyler in the painting, but General Schuyler was not there. So Varick was there, and he's not in the portrait. Schuyler was not there, but he is in the portrait. That's the way it goes. A little artistic license, I guess you would say. And his ward did change, however, when on January 12th, 1780, the Continental Congress abolished the Muster Master Department and discharged its officers. Upon getting the news, Varick returned to New Jersey, and for a time he served light duty in the Bergen County Militia, commanded by his uncle, Colonel Teunus. He brushed up on his law in this period, did Richard Varick, and it was actually a good thing that he did brush up on his law, because in April of 1779, William Livingston, who by this time was the governor of New Jersey, appointed him a solicitor and giving him the right to practice law here in New Jersey. So Varick, by this time, is actually able to practice law in both New York State and in New Jersey. And Livingston, he was the first governor. William Livingston became the first governor, replacing William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's son, who became a loyalist. So he appoints him, does William Livingston, he appoints him an attorney, and the war, however, remained ever present, with a strong British and Hessian presence in the area carrying out offensive operations. And staying close, Commander-in-Chief George Washington established his headquarters at the home of Colonel Teunus, Richard Varick's uncle, throughout July of 1780 and again in October and fall of 1780. On August 13th, Richard Dye became an aide-de-camp to one of George Washington's most trusted advisors and officers, Benedict Arnold. Arnold had performed well in the Patriot cause, since helping take Fort Ticonderoga in May of 1775, and then more recently at Saratoga. Now he commanded near West Point, headquartering himself at the Beverly Robinson House across the North River from West Point. In August and September, Varick and others began whispering that Arnold was acting strangely. For one thing, the general had been spending time in the company of British Major John Andre at the home of Joshua Het Smith, the younger brother of William Smith, Jr., who was one-third of the triumvirate. You know, it's interesting because Varick had likely known the Smith brothers prior to the war. William Smith, Jr., who I mentioned earlier, who was one-third of the triumvirate with William Livingston and John Moore Scott, was an attorney. His brother Joshua Het Smith was an attorney. The world of New York City jurisprudence was very small, and so it is almost a certainty that Richard Varick, he would have known Joshua Het Smith, who had been conspiring with Benedict Arnold. Prior to the war, he almost certainly would have known him. When Varick's treason came to light, his aide's fidelity too came into question. Varick was briefly detained, and though quickly released, fell under a cloud of suspicion. Varick was ill throughout the Arnold affair and demanded a court of inquiry to exonerate himself. On October 12th, he wrote to George Washington, who was again headquartering himself at the home of Varick's uncle, Colonel Teunis Dye, that I have the honor to inform your Excellency, that I think my health is so far restored as to enable me to bear the fatigue incident to an attendance on a court of inquiry into my conduct. While your Excellency, which your Excellency was so indulgent as to promise me, as soon as I should be able to attend it. So the inquiry actually began at Robinson House on November 2nd. Varick testified on his own behalf. Here is a text of that. Varick testified on his own behalf, and read into the record too were depositions that Varick had solicited from supporters, including Philip Schuyler. Varick was exonerated and his reputation cleared on November 5th. But still without a staff position, because he was still without a staff position, he practiced law in New York State for a time. You know, George Washington kept meticulous records both as a planter and as a soldier, and good record keeping was actually essential to him because everywhere he went in his tent throughout the American Revolutionary War, there were just vast amounts of paperwork that passed through his headquarters. And you know, paperwork was also important to George Washington throughout the war because he didn't draw a salary, but they did pay for his expenses. So he kept every receipt, and so he was going to make sure, George Washington was, to record that paperwork. And the correspondence was voluminous and getting out of hand. And so in April of 1781, just as the war was entering its 7th year, Washington wrote to Samuel Huntington, president of the Continental Congress, regarding his papers and averred that unless a set of writers are employed for the sole purpose of recording them, it will not be in my power to accomplish this necessary work, and equally impracticable, perhaps, to preserve them from injury and loss. Washington continued to Huntington that organizing the papers must be done under the inspection of a man of character in whom entire confidence can be placed, and who is capable of arranging the papers and methodicizing the register. Congress quickly agreed to Washington's request, and on May 25th, Washington offered Lieutenant Colonel Richard Varick the position of recording secretary. He began in July 1781. In his capacity as George Washington's recording secretary, Richard Varick was in a genuine sense one of the first historians of the American Revolutionary War. He spent the final 2.5 years of the war primarily in Poughkeepsie, overseeing a staff of approximately half a dozen men in transcribing, collating, and organizing the backlog of letters, orders, and communiques on topics large and small that poured to and from Washington's headquarters. Aided by Rochambeau and Lafayette, Washington accepted the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown in October of 1781. The war was largely over. Next came the long wait for peace in Europe. Even before peace officially came, military leaders began thinking of their legacy. Largely at the impetus of Henry Knox, now a major general, Continental Army officers met at the Fishkill headquarters of Major General Frederick von Steuben on May 13, 1783, and founded the Society of the Cincinnati, a fraternal organization of Revolutionary War officers whose purpose was to advocate for veterans' interests, perpetuate the war's memory, and preserve Republican virtues. To go with the national body, the Cincinnati's founders created state chapters that are still here with us nearly 2.5 centuries later. Alexander McDougall would serve as the first president of the New York State Society of the Cincinnati. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay signed the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783. The British evacuated New York City on November 25th, after which Washington and his entourage rode triumphantly into the city. Through early December, there was much celebrating. Washington bade farewell to his officers at Samuel Fraunces Tavern in Lower Manhattan on December 4th, resigned his commission to the Continental Congress in Annapolis on the 23rd, and returned to Mount Vernon in time for Christmas Eve dinner. And that month, Richard Varick completed Washington's papers. And here's a written copy of that letter I showed you earlier, in which Varick, George Washington writes to Varick. Washington wrote to Varick on New Year's Day, 1784, to express his appreciation. The public and other papers which were committed to your charge, and the books in which they have been recorded under your inspection, have come safe to hand. I take this first opportunity of signifying my entire approbation of the manner in which you have executed the important duties of recording secretary, and the satisfaction I feel in having my papers so properly arranged and so correctly recorded, and beg you will accept my thanks for the care and attention which you have given this business. And so here we have the letter. And also that same day, George Washington, as President General of the Society of the Cincinnati, signed Richard Varick's diploma, his membership diploma in the Society of Cincinnati, which clearly meant a lot to Richard Varick. This bowl is actually at Morristown National Historical Park. What we see here actually is a copy of Richard Varick's Society of the Cincinnati diploma that was written out this day by George Washington. This bowl was actually made in China, was part of the China trade, and China in the late 18th century they were experts at producing fine china, primarily for the Europe and now the American market. And the Varick bowl that they have there at Morristown is actually one of the most exquisite examples of Chinese porcelain that one will ever see. After the flush of victory came the hard work of independence. The young nation faced seemingly insurmountable challenges. These included, but were hardly limited to, economic depression, civic unrest, tensions with Native Americans, leeriness of a resentful, still powerful Britain, who was still very much here with their bases in the West Indies and in British Canada and elsewhere, debts owed to France and other European powers, border disputes between various states, the uncertainties of Western expansion, post-traumatic stress disorder among discharged soldiers, and back pay and other restitution for officers and men. The Articles of Confederation were a weak vessel to handle these and other issues. Richard Varick had spent his formative 20s in the service of the Patriot cause and was just 30 when the Revolutionary War ended. The New York City to which he had returned, had experienced 2 devastating fires during the war that had destroyed much of the city's buildings and infrastructure. His mentor and friend, John Moore Scott, died on September 14th, and amidst these challenges, however, were opportunities. As mentioned, Varick held jobs of increasing responsibility, rebuilding New York City and state, and the positions, as I mentioned, that he held. He was part of the Common Council. He was the Recorder of New York City. He was the Speaker of the New York State Assembly. He was the State Attorney General. And then, of course, he was the mayor. Another project that he worked on, which I discussed a little bit, was that he and attorney Samuel Jones distilled into a comprehensible digest form all of the legal statutes that had been written over now what had been almost a decade since the New York State Constitution had been ratified in April of 1777. Varick and Jones spent nearly 2 years on this project. They knew most of the people who had drafted the New York State Constitution, which had been drafted by John Jay and John Moore and Scott and James Duane and Robert R. Livingston. And they brought a lawyer's touch to what they did. It's kind of interesting, that period right after the war. You know, there's an expression that they use in British history for the period right after the Glorious Revolution of the 1680s, what is called the Revolution Settlement. Basically, which means once the fighting is over and the peace has been restored, you have to get down to the gritty details of leadership and governance. Once you have that transfer of power from one group to another, you know, that is, after all, what makes it a revolution, right? So you have a revolution settlement, and Varick and Samuel Jones put into digest form all of the laws that had been written over the previous decade. And the Confederation Congress moved to New York City in January of 1785, making Manhattan the capital of the nation. So New York City becomes the capital in January of 1785. Confederation Congressman James Monroe met local girl Elizabeth Courtwright here, well, in Manhattan, and on February 16th, 1786, the two married in Trinity Church. There must have been something in the air, you know, that year, because that spring on May 8th, Richard Varick wedded the woman we see here, Maria Roosevelt. Here we see, this photo was taken again at the American Revolution Institute. And here we see Richard Varick in his later years and Maria Roosevelt Varick, his wife. In June and July of 1788, Varick's new father-in-law, Isaac Roosevelt, joined other Federalists such as James Duane, John Jay, Chancellor Robert R. Livingston, and Alexander Hamilton in ratifying the United States Constitution at the State Convention in Poughkeepsie. On April 30th, 1789, at Federal Hall on Wall Street, the ubiquitous Chancellor Livingston, a drafter of the Declaration of Independence and brother of Richard Montgomery's widow, Janet Livingston, swore George Washington in as the first president of the United States. When New York Mayor James Duane accepted a federal judgeship, Governor George Clinton appointed Richard Varick as his successor. He began the mayoralty on October 14th, 1789. Mayor Varick wrote to Vice President John Adams on July 21st, 1790, that the corporation of this city have applied to the President of the United States to permit Colonel John Trumbull to take his portrait to be placed in the City Hall, to which the President has consented. And when Varick wrote that letter to Vice President Adams, he was actually referring to a letter that he'd written a day or two earlier to now President Washington's secretary, Tobias Lear, asking if George Washington would sit for a portrait, which Washington obviously did. And this was actually more controversial at the time than we might think, because many people were actually upset about this, because the idea of painting a portrait like this of the president to many Americans in the early American period smacked of aristocracy and monarchism. So for Varick to write a letter seeking a commission to paint President Washington was actually a somewhat controversial move. So something to keep in mind. Mayor Varick soon commissioned Trumbull for a portrait of Revolutionary War general and current New York Governor George Clinton. Trumbull was the perfect choice for this project, having served on Washington's staff during the war and just returned from studying art in Europe under Benjamin West. Like the mayor, the governor, and the president, Trumbull was also a member of the Society of the Cincinnati. The artist duly finished the paintings, and one thing I find so interesting about these paintings is that if you notice, he doesn't paint them as the civilians that they were by this time. George Washington, of course, was the President of the United States, and George Clinton was the governor of New York. And but he doesn't paint them as civilians. He actually, John Trumbull, when he paints these, he paints them as military officers, which I think is actually quite telling. The national government left New York City in August of 1790, after which Federal Hall again became City Hall. As mentioned, it was a contentious time with much unfinished business. In the late 1790s, New York City experienced rapid economic development and nearly doubled its population to over 60,000 as New Yorkers rebuilt their city. When Thomas Jefferson became president, he and his allies cleaned house. The same happened in New York City. On August 24, 1801, Varick was replaced by Janet Montgomery's brother, the Democratic Republican Edward Livingston. Varick, as I mentioned, remained active in banking, philanthropy, and real estate. And among much else, he was a founder of Jersey City. He was the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Columbia College, and he was later president of the American Bible Society. He and Maria also purchased a house here in New Jersey, in just across the river. So he and Maria, they purchased a house across the Hudson River. Actually, you can see the Hudson River, and you can see Manhattan across the street from here, across the river. So they maintain this as a summer home, and but they were still pretty much Manhattanites at this time. They lived near Wall Street, and in 1806, Richard Varick became president of the New York State Society of the Cincinnati. So actually becomes, Richard Varick does, the president of the New York State Society of the Cincinnati, which he would remain for the next 25 years until he died in 1831. After the War of 1812, there was increasing talk of exhuming General Richard Montgomery in Quebec and reinterring him in New York City. At a July 4th, 1818 New York State Society of the Cincinnati meeting, Chapter President Varick read a letter from Governor DeWitt Clinton offering economic and material support for this project. A committee comprising John Trumbull and others was granted unlimited powers to make the necessary arrangements for paying the last tribute of respect to the remains of that distinguished hero of the Revolution. And that they did. 2 days later, Janet Montgomery stood on the porch of her Hudson Valley home and watched the Richmond sail southward carrying the remains of her husband. She actually fainted dead away when she saw his remains passing down the Hudson. She'd been a widow by this time for 43 years. So it shows you how young they were again. And when Richard Montgomery was reinterred at St. Paul's Chapel on Lower Broadway on July 8, 1818, Richard Varick, Marinus Willett, and John Trumbull were among the pallbearers. So here we see a newspaper clipping from that time, and we see Richard Montgomery's headstone, And if you know St. Paul's, he's buried like basically right there. Took this picture last summer. So he's there. Millions of, thousands of people walk past him every day and have no idea that he's right there. And the conclusion of the War of 1812 had ushered in the so-called era of good feelings. From 1815 to 1825, Americans negotiated the Missouri Compromise, expanded the number of states in the Union to 24, and built the Erie Canal. Americans were feeling confident. This was the milieu in which President James Monroe and Congress invited the Marquis de Lafayette to visit the United States for a grand tour. In August 1824, the Frenchmen sailed into New York for what would be a whirlwind 14 months through all 24 states. On September 6, 1824, Richard Varick and the New York State Society of the Cincinnati, with Varick as president, hosted a fete in honor of Lafayette's 67th birthday. Varick next hosted Lafayette at Prospect Hall and saw him off on his journey. A triumphant Lafayette returned to New York City for rest and revelry in July of 1825, which included a trip across the river to Prospect Hall on July 9th for some quiet time with his old friend. Lafayette, he actually sailed home. We were talking about this earlier across the street in the old Dutch cemetery. But Lafayette, his grand tour, he sailed home from Washington, D.C. on September 9th, 1825. And if you're doing the math on that, you will note that that was 200 years ago yesterday. So yesterday was the bicentennial of Lafayette's sailing back. Lafayette was gone. Varick and the others in the Society of Cincinnati remembered him. Here we have a portrait of a drawing of Lafayette. It's a rendering of Lafayette in Paris during the July Revolution of 1830. And on the right, we have a letter written by Richard Varick to Philip Hone, who was the mayor of New York City in the 1820s, and he was a diarist. He was sort of George Templeton Strong before George Templeton Strong was Philip Hone. He kept a diary for many decades, and he was a diarist and a bon vivant. And here, Richard Varick, as president of the Society of Cincinnati, is writing a letter to Philip Hone in which they are stating publicly their support for Lafayette and the July Revolution that would overthrow King Charles X in Paris. So they kept up, they did with Varick. It's an interesting time too, because by this time we are now in the 1830s, and a new generation of Americans is entering the political stage. Here we actually have a letter written by Daniel Webster in which he is accepting a dinner invitation to speak in New York City in March of 1931 about the nullification crisis. By this time, we are in the Jacksonian era. Actually, this is an invitation. Actually, see Richard Varick's name up top, right there. You can kind of sort of make it out. And so actually did Richard Varick into the time of Henry Clay and John Calhoun and Daniel Webster and the statesmen of that era. In the ensuing years, as Americans celebrated the 1826 Jubilee and entered the Jacksonian era, Richard Varick entered the winter of his life. A new generation of leadership was emerging. Many whom he had once known were gone, and he was becoming increasingly rueful. In May of 1831, he visited Mount Vernon, still a private residence owned by the Washington family. James Monroe himself died on July 4th, 1831, died on the 55th anniversary of Independence Day, 5 years to the day after Jefferson and Adams had both died. He died actually at the home of his daughter and son-in-law which was at 63 Prince Street on the northwest corner of Prince and Lafayette. So here, this is a picture of the northwest corner of Prince and Lafayette. It's a photo of the James Monroe House where President Monroe died. Remember I said he was a Confederation congressman, and he met his wife and married here in New York City. So James Monroe actually died in this building. This is a rendering of it as it was around the turn of the last century. And here's a photo of that same spot that I took this past summer. They actually closed some of the streets in New York City down during the summer so cyclists and pedestrians can go up and down. And so this is that same spot. Actually, this is not that funeral. You know, when James Monroe died, it's interesting because when James Monroe died, more than 100,000 New Yorkers turned out for James Monroe's funeral, in which Richard Varick was a pallbearer. You know, when we think of New York City presidential funerals, what normally comes to mind is Ulysses S. Grant's funeral about half a century later. But before the Grant funeral, we had the Monroe funeral. 100,000 people showed up in a city whose population at the time was only 200,000. So half of New York City turned out for James Monroe's funeral. He was buried in New York City Marble Cemetery in July of 1831. He actually is no longer there. He was actually exhumed and reinterred in 1858, which was the centennial of James Monroe's birth. But he was